A story with guts or glory, situation or suspense. If you've got a story, you've got a motion picture. Those are the words of John Wayne. And in Ernest K. Gann's The High and the Mighty, he found a story that had all those ingredients, the right ingredients to make one terrific motion picture. Imagine climbing aboard a routine flight from Honolulu to San Francisco, smooth flying until something goes wrong. And what's routine becomes terrifying. An engine bursts into flames. The pilot, played by Robert Stack, loses his nerve, and it's up to the co-pilot, John Wayne, to take the emergency into his own hands. Will the frantic radio calls be heard? Is there hope for survival? The plane, losing fuel and altitude, limps through the air with little hope of going the distance to San Francisco, as human dramas unfold on board. The High and the Mighty was the fifth film produced by Wayne Fellows, now called Batjack, one of the first major Hollywood production companies controlled by a major star. It followed another highly successful aviation film, Island in the Sky. Both of them were written by pilot Ernest K. Gann from his own popular novels. Wayne, his partner Robert Fellows, and renowned director William Wellman assembled a hand-picked cast to play the 22 people on the plane. In addition to Stack, crew and passengers included the talented Claire Trevor, Jan Sterling, Lorraine Day, Phil Harris, Robert Newton, David Bryan, a host of experienced character actors, and such newcomers as Karen Sharp, William Campbell, Joe Avedon, and John Smith. Interestingly, the last role to be filled was that of the co-pilot. John Wayne hadn't planned to appear in the picture. The part was originally offered to Spencer Tracy, but turned out to be one of Wayne's most memorable portrayals. It also reunited him with Claire Trevor, who played opposite Wayne in the film that made him a star, John Ford's Stagecoach. The High and the Mighty kicked off the danger in the sky genre, inspiring other filmmakers to place hapless passengers in all kinds of jeopardy on planes, cruise ships, buses, trains, cable cars, even skyscrapers and theme parks. It was one of the first generation of CinemaScope film, and director William Wellman, who'd made the silent movie aviation classic Wings, took on the challenge of using the widescreen format to heighten the contrast between the expanse of sky and sea against the confining space of the cabin and cockpit. And we can't overlook the importance of Dmitri Tiomkin's music. It not only won him an Academy Award, but it helped define the movie. The big sound and the sweeping orchestral theme perfectly suited the dramatic power of the story. And the appealing idea of Wayne as the pilot whistling that theme led to a hit record in 1954. The High and the Mighty had its world premiere at Grauman's Egyptian Theater on Hollywood Boulevard. It proved to be a tremendous hit. The High and the Mighty received 6 Academy Award nominations, with Dmitri Tiomkin taking home the Academy Award for Best Score. And it changed the lives of many young viewers who were inspired to take to the skies as pilots and stewardesses. Younger viewers discovering this movie for the first time might find it quaint, but you have to remember that this was very much a film of its time, reflecting not only the attitudes and mores of the 1950s, but the mainstream Hollywood approach to storytelling. And in those days, movies were all about stories, not sensations or special effects. So don't watch it as an artifact. Try to step back in time and meet the movie on its own terms. Now it's time to climb aboard and buckle in. After laying dormant for decades, The High and the Mighty is back, beautifully restored and ready to take off.
Hollywood is aglow for Warner Brothers' world premiere of The High and the Mighty. The film's star, John Wayne, introduces newcomer Karen Sharp. Industry pioneer Harry M. Warner and Mrs. Warner attend the gala opening along with Jack L. Warner, daughter Barbara, Richard Andrews, and Bob Fellows. The overflow crowd cheers the introduction of Paul Kelly, who has a featured role in the Wayne Fellows CinemaScope production. Jane Wyman, with husband Freddie Carger, adds glamour to Hollywood's brightest turnout of stars in years. Colin Llewellyn Parsons arrives with Jimmy McHugh. Warner Brothers producer-director Mervyn LeRoy, Mrs. LeRoy, Anita Louise, and husband Buddy Adler join too in the premiere for The High and the Mighty.
Hello. Must seem kind of funny to see me on the screen with a book in my hand instead of a gun. But when you're hunting for what makes great motion picture entertainment, here's where you begin, with a story. And a good story is only as strong as its characters, and only as interesting as the things they do. That's what made Hondo. That's what makes this story, people. The High and the Mighty is about people, all kinds. Good, bad, strong and weak. Brave ones and cowards tossed together on an adventure that spans 3,000 miles of ocean. They're people you won't forget. I know I won't, because Bill Wellman brought them all to life exactly as Ernest Gann, the author of this bestseller, described them.
Yes, John. There's May, who could talk to a man without saying a word. Lydia, who was as low as high society can get. Sullivan, whose nerves of steel were beginning to rust. Sally, who lived in a world of whistles. Ed, who found a silver lining in every cloud. Pardy, a heart full of courage wrapped up in a bundle of nerves. Childs, a wealthy collector of other men's wives. Agnew, a coward until he held a gun in his hand. Spaulding, a right girl who had to be nice to some wrong people.
Well, there they are, the people who make this story. Oh, yeah, and I almost forgot, I'm in it, too. If you read this bestseller, I play the part of Dan Roman. I think you'll like The High and the Mighty. It has a lot of powerful action, moments of tender romance, violent emotions, and good, rich humor, too. I think it's more than a motion picture. It's an emotional experience that you'll never forget. So I hope you'll be with us when we take off. Thanks.
One by one, they boarded the plane. The most bizarre group of people ever thrown together by fate on the most exciting adventure that ever spanned an ocean. There was Dan, who had used up his 9 lives and was starting on number 10. May, who could talk to a man without saying a word. Lydia, who was as low as high society can get. Sullivan, whose nerves of steel were beginning to rust. Sally, who lived in a world of whistles. Ed, who had taught himself to face disaster with a smile. Pardy, a heart full of courage wrapped up in a bundle of nerves. Childs, a wealthy collector of other men's wives. Flaherty, who thought he could hide his fears in a bottle. Agnew, a coward, until he held a gun in his hand. Spaulding, a right girl who had to be nice to some wrong people. Yes, the brash and the brave, big-timers and two-timers, the chaste and the cheats, morning glories and nighttime women, suddenly transformed by a single stroke of fate into people with all pretense gone and every violent emotion turned loose.
You're quite a conqueror with the ladies, aren't you? That should interest you, madam. I've had enough of them. What's the matter, you guys?
Hey, what's this all about?
Crazy? Break it up! It's crazy. It's got a gun. What? The bottle on it.
Yeah, homie, pull the bottle, quick. Welby, check your final position. I'm going to take her down.
Wait a few more minutes,
Do as I say.
But it looks like...
Do as I say.
Give him a few more minutes.
I've already waited too long. Here we go.
No, we don't.
Get a hold of yourself, you yellow.
Boy, what a movie. Envisioned and created in an era when commercial flying was just becoming an everyday occurrence for ordinary people. The High and the Mighty was filmed when cinematography and the mechanics of making a movie were undergoing many changes. Just look at the imaginative use Wellman made of CinemaScope and the brilliance of its color. The 1950s, a time when a box office star and his young company had the guts to stand up to the studios and demand to do it their way. The result? A film that would not only become a commercial success, but would define a whole new genre. The High and the Mighty won awards and acclaim, gave rise to new stars and new life to established ones. Imagine the difficulty in casting the 22 main roles and the range of experience the actors brought to the film. For John Quaylen, his 152nd screen appearance, but the very first for Karen Sharp.
Just plain scared.
What must it have been like to be on location or on the soundstage for a film that became not just a hit, but the kind of movie that people held in their memories for years and years? A movie worth preserving, a process John Wayne's son, Michael, began to ensure his father's legacy. In the segments that follow, step behind the scenes. Travel back to the 1950s and see where it all began with the founding of Batjack. Meet some of the many talented people who were involved in bringing this classic to the screen. Hear some of the insider stories. And find out more about the man who was once a World War I flying ace and brought his special talents and love of flying to the directing of this picture. Discover how a Russian-born composer changed the way movies were marketed forever. And hear how the airline industry used this film to emphasize the safety of flying and the prowess of its pilots.
The High and the Mighty. It was a bestseller book. Ernie Gann. Every actor in town desperately wanted that part.
We had to cast the pilot, and that isn't always easy to have somebody playing a vis-a-vis with John Wayne and keep up the strength.
I had a crazy agent called Bill Schifrin. So what he did is he sent a wire every hour on the hour to William Wellman saying, Stack is Sullivan. Nobody can play Sullivan but Stack. Stack, wake him up in the middle of the night.
This went on and on for 2 solid weeks. And then all of a sudden we got another telegram and Bill said, oh, to hell with it. Listen, if he wants it that badly, maybe we ought to get him the part. Get him in here, I want to talk to him.
I walk in there, shaking in my boots, and there's William Wellman, steely blue eyes, looking me right in the eye, and he said, all right, Stack, what makes you think you can play this part? And at that particular point in time, I was enough involved in the Sullivan character that I, for the first time in my life, I explained why I thought I was the only one who could play it. You were limited in the cockpit. You couldn't wave your arms around. It had to come from the inside out. Anyway, I went on for about 5 minutes. At the end of that, he says, you know, Duke Wayne has already promised this part to somebody else, Bob Cummings. He's a flyer. He thinks only a flyer can play a flyer. I said, but you got me convinced, and I'll tell you what, if you get this part, and if you screw up, he said, John Wayne is going to strangle the both of us.
Maybe if I explain exactly what has happened, you'll feel better all around.
Those kind of pictures are fun to cast, especially when you have a whole bunch of people that like to be in the picture. There was an agent in those days named Leon Lance, and if it was ever a prototype Hollywood agent with young people coming up with papers stuffed in his pocket, he'd come and bring me presents every week.
Batjack, which was the John Wayne Company, was just about a block away from Leon Lance's office. And he took me in one afternoon. It was very late in the afternoon because he'd heard this part of Nell Buck was being cast.
And he said, I hear you're testing for the High and the Mighty. I said, yeah, but Leon, I think you're a little late because the bill has already met all the people and we're testing tomorrow. He said, listen, just let Karen test, it'll be okay. I said, maybe it's okay with you, but do you know Bill Wellman? Karen arrived and Bill wanted to know who she was. He said, you mean I'm testing somebody I haven't met? I said, well, look, Bill, she's here. John Smith is here, one of the boys that you selected.
And luckily for me, the girl that was supposed to test opposite John Smith, agent had pulled her out that morning.
And he always said, okay, let's test her. Like, oh, let's test her and get it over with.
And when the scene was over, he said, where have you been?
I said, what do you mean? He said, those two are the parts. They got the parts. He didn't test anybody else. And this is in '53 and '55 when I directed my first movie. I put Karen Sharp in the lead with another person from the picture, Bill Campbell.
San Francisco wants to know the nature of our trouble.
Tell him if we knew, we'd have told him in the first place.
Well, I received a call from Bill Wellman, and he said, I will not talk money with you, but I've got a great part for you. And I said, I'll take it. And that was it. He says, you're perfect. And then I realized after I read the script in the book that he meant that I was smart aleck, you know, which I could do very well.
I got somebody, a ship. This is Christopher Treadle calling 420. I can hear you very clearly.
Wayne came in one day and he said, I saw on TV the greatest little guy. Bob Fellows, his partner, so what's his name? He says, Gonzalez. He said, Gonzalez who? He says, Gonzalez. All right. No, he said, Pedro Gonzalez. He'd seen him in the Groucho Marx show.
Keep that ship in the air if you can, boy. He's way down here. Over. I get in the High and the Mighty because that Jack, they put me on the contract. So then I went to see Mr. William Wellman, you know. And he said, hey, I like you. And I'm going to put you in my movie, you know. Get out of here. It was very rough for me, you know. See, they put me on the stage and in the boat, and then they put me with ropes. Oh, get out of here. Hello, Honolulu. I'm supposed to go down and read my lines, and then go back and read another line.
While he's trying to balance himself in the boat, and they're pulling it with a rope, he also has to remember the dialogue, which he's not remembering, so Bill Wellman got a little impatient.
So he says, script girl, write the lines over there, you know, so Pedro, when he passes, he can read them.
And Pedro says, I have a problem with that. He says, don't you talk back to me. What do you mean you have a problem with it?
And I said, because I don't know how to read. He said, you Mexican. He jumped and hugged me and kissed me right here.
And then our little Pedro Gonzalez could do no wrong.
I was just starting to serve the passengers. Should I go ahead?
You might as well.
It was a very pleasant experience. One of the most exciting things I've ever done, and Bill Wellman is the angel of the world.
I remember Doe Avedon at one time was supposed to walk up the passageway and do next to nothing. She kept bumping into the chairs, and he said, for God's sake, Avedon, can't you even walk? That's not so hard. She said, Mr. Wellman, you got me so nervous, my knees won't work. And with this, he said, okay, cut. Then the smile breaks out, and the eyes light up, and he puts his arm around her, and you realize this is the way he has to work to achieve what he wants to achieve.
Bill Wellman, to me, was one of the most unforgettable, quote, characters that you will ever meet. And tremendous talent as a director. We had a grip on the set of The High and the Mighty. I remember he said, I hear you're a runner of the 50-yard dash, and an ex-baseball player. And the guy said, yes, Mr. Wellman. He said, well, do you want to race me? And he says, well, yes, Mr. Wellman. And you know they raced, and guess who won? Bill won. He was 58 years old, and that's no kidding.
We were doing a scene in the cockpit, and John Wayne said to Bill Wellman, will I have to take off my hat? So Bill Wellman said, yes, I think I'll ask you to. So Wayne said, oh, shoot, that means I have to get the rug on and whatever. So he went off to get his rug on. Bill turned to us and he said, I didn't care whether he took off his hat or not, but if he didn't want to take it off, I thought he should take it off. So he was the devil.
Duke always tipped his hat to, even though he's a big star, to John Ford or to Wellman. In fact, when I appeared the first day on the set, and Bob Cummings was the one that John Wayne said was going to play Sullivan, as I walked on the set, Duke put his hand out, he said, Mr. Cummings, I presume. That was the way we started the show.
Wayne was a special guy, and I mean that. I had worked with Wayne before in Operation Pacific. When I got The High and the Mighty, I knew that he had suggested me. I had a big scene with him in which I smart off with him. I was frightened to death the day that I did that scene with him because it was pure dialogue. And I thought to myself, how can I talk to John Wayne like this? I mean, it's impossible. But he was so attentive and so with it. And we got through the scene, never made a mistake.
I've been flying a long time, Hobie.
Yeah. Only you're not the captain. Maybe because your so-called luck ran out on you once down in South America.
When they saw the movie at Warner Brothers, the first man who congratulated me was John Wayne. Did you know that that movie is in Times Square for 2 years? Clark Gable congratulated me. Humphrey Bogart congratulated me. He said, you kid, you're all right, you know. But thanks to Duke, he opened the door for me.
When John Wayne walked into a room, there was a big man coming into the room. He had a tremendous magnetic personality that we'll never forget, actually. And John Wayne was one terrific actor.
Many stories have been told about the people John Wayne hired to work on his films. Director William Wellman was one of the most talented and colorful, a complex man who enjoyed an incredible life and career.
William Wellman was one of the most notable directors of Hollywood's golden era and was profiled in Kevin Brownlow's The Parades Gone By. Brownlow, a noted film historian and documentarian, has written 8 books and helped restore over 25 silent movies, including William Wellman's Wings.
Wellman is one of my favorite directors, and someone should make a feature film about him, although he'd be impossible to cast. They don't make that sort of character anymore. He was so colorful, so charismatic, and so charming. Although people I've met told me he could be as tough as a drill sergeant on the floor. The High and the Mighty was the most commercially successful film of William Wellman's career. But commercially successful films are rarely the most artistically courageous. I think Wellman did a fine job of holding all the elements together, but it doesn't have much of his personality.
It's an intimate picture about the lives of all these people on board this plane, so it's not really the kind of thing my father did very much of. My father made every kind of movie. That was what he enjoyed. He made westerns and war films and gangster films. He made comedies, and he even made a musical. I mean, everything.
The point about Wellman pictures is when you see his gangster films, when you see his films about hobos riding the rails, they were incredibly realistic, and this wasn't. And that really took me aback when I saw it for the first time.
I mean, he always thought that this wasn't really his type of film. You know, it's separate tables, it's Grand Hotel, it's Stagecoach, you know, it's kind of a drawing room. The idea was they were inside an airplane. That was important to my father. His so-called flight to fame was Wings in 1927. It won the Oscars, the Best Picture, the first Best Picture. And he proceeded to do 11 stories of the air out of 76 films. You know, he always went back there because he was a flyer in the First World War. He went to France, joined the Lafayette Flying Corps, and was a decorated fighter pilot in 1917, 1918. Pilots were more important to him than anybody in the picture business.
Wellman loved aviation, and this story was a natural for him. But whereas in 1927, he insisted on all his actors going up in real aircraft, filming themselves for Wings, here his aeroplane is a studio set. I suppose that was the only practical way to do it in the 1950s.
Warner Brothers was releasing all of the Wayne pictures, and my father and Wayne went out to Warner Brothers one day to talk to Jack Warner, and Jack Warner had a problem. Now, Jack Warner was not going to tell John Wayne what pictures he could make and which ones he couldn't. He was happy to be able to distribute Wayne's films. But he told my father and Wayne, he said, you know, this is ridiculous, this High and the Mighty business. You cannot hold an audience for over 100 minutes in a plane. You just can't do it. And they did it. The High and the Mighty was the precursor to all these airplane airport disaster pictures. It started this whole train of films. I mean, the jeopardy that those people are put in just holds you there.
Bobby, tell San Francisco we're experiencing some unusual vibration and to stand by till further advised.
You want to declare an emergency?
No. Not yet.
My father, if he did a movie out of a book, from a book, he stayed true to the story.
Wellman's relationship with writers is a very important part of his career. Wellman was a stickler for working with the writer on the script, and once he fell for a story, he told that story much as the writer had written it. And this wasn't the Hollywood way. They often bought a book just for its title.
Ernie Gant kept thinking he could write it better when he did the screenplays. And my father said, I don't want it better, I want it the way he wrote it in the book.
One element that Wellman added to this film was the little kid that sleeps through the whole adventure, and he told me he cast his son Michael for that.
And he thought it would add something very special to the story to have a little kid on board this plane who goes to sleep and wakes up, never was involved in any of the problem, never knew there was any trouble. And I think he was so right. That character is just great.
You know, space guns don't kill you.
No.
They just make you stiff.
If Wellman had thrown away the script and written his own, I suspect it would have had more bite and more humor. But he realized that Ernest Gann had given him something exceptional, and that was proved by its commercial performance. So obviously he succeeded.
My father would have a reading of the script before they started shooting with all the main actors and, of course, the writer, maybe even the producer. They would read the script, the whole script from beginning to end. And my father would say, now, if we have any problems, anybody has any problems, you know, we're going to talk about it and work it out now. Because when we start filming, then, you know, we're going by the script.
High and the Mighty is the story of an aircraft full of rather exceptional and bizarre characters. You can't appreciate how difficult the casting must have been because it seems to work so seamlessly.
He said at one time that this was the most difficult film to cast, partly because of problems that were beyond his control. For instance, initially they wanted Spencer Tracy to play the lead role. Tracy said, yeah, I'll do it. So now they moved on, casting the other roles. When they got the other roles finally cast and they were getting down to where they wanted to start shooting, then Tracy said, I'm not going to do it. And my father talked Wayne into doing it. Wayne didn't really want to do it. He didn't feel it was, you know, the right kind of role for him.
Spencer Tracy would have brought a solid reassurance to the role. Wayne would make you think it's going to be dangerous, terribly dangerous, although he'll still get you through.
John Wayne is such a mega star. You can't take your eyes off him when he's on the screen. And I think it was a whole different kind of a role for him. I don't think he ever played a role quite like that.
420, ready for takeoff.
My father used John Wayne as a stuntman in a movie called Central Airport back in the 30s. And they had a wonderful relationship. They did 6 pictures together.
I've noticed that throughout film history that directors tend to cast actors who are idealized versions of themselves. And when I first met Wellman in the 60s, I thought immediately of John Wayne. I thought even then that he sounded like Wayne.
I've been flying since 1917, and I don't like this sort of thing any better than you do.
Wellman had a healthy disrespect for acting. He tried it himself, and he couldn't stand appearing before the camera. I don't think he was one of those directors like Cukor who loved actors, but he always got marvelous performances.
Hollywood is aglow for Warner Brothers' world premiere of The High and the Mighty.
The High and the Mighty, of course, was the most popular picture of 1954. It held the record for a long time for the fastest return of negative cost.
Well, The High and the Mighty opened on May the 26th, 1954, and by the beginning of July it was a huge success. And Wellman felt brave enough to reveal indiscreetly to the press who had turned him down. And it's surprising because there's Barbara Stanwyck, who's a great pet of his, Ida Lupino, Ginger Rogers, Joan Crawford.
Clara Trevor and Jan Sterling play the 2 roles, and both get nominated for Academy Awards. all of those major stars who were at the right age at this particular time to play those roles, nobody wanted to play those roles.
But it's nonetheless astounding when you think of the commercial success of this picture that such big names turned him down, and they must have been kicking themselves all the way to the Oscars.
It's the biggest night of the year in Hollywood as Oscar steps into the spotlight.
When it came to the Academy Awards, The High and the Mighty was a picture that couldn't be ignored. It lost Best Picture to On the Waterfront, and deservedly so. On the Waterfront was a masterpiece by anyone's standards. The High and the Mighty, by comparison, must have looked safe, and I suspect that was why it didn't do as well as everybody had hoped.
We're gonna make it.
The picture was just unbelievably popular and nominated for 6 Academy Awards and won the Oscar for the best score. Everywhere I go, people are coming up saying, "Where can I see The High and the Mighty?" You know, I've been hearing this for years. Now I'm happy to be able to say, you're going to be able to see it again very soon.
Dmitri Tiomkin was one of the great composers of Hollywood's golden age. His score and title song for The High and the Mighty were vital to the film's success.
Dmitri Tiomkin was one of the great composers of Hollywood. He was part of the golden age of Hollywood as it's come to be known, and certainly one of the most successful spokesmen for that whole generation.
Dmitri Tiomkin was a performer, whether as a pianist, as a composer, or as a personality who happened to show up on a Jack Benny television program.
He played in vaudeville in the late 1920s. He had a background as a classical pianist in Europe. His wife was a ballerina and choreographer and dance director.
He wrote some original music for her ballet pieces and had written some other small compositions on the side.
So he was not only aware of movement on the screen and how music could affect it, but I think he also had a great sense of drama.
Up comes the main title, and he's not tiptoeing around here. Right from the get-go, you know you're dealing with a composer who's not afraid to contribute something. He gets right down to business and says it in a very concise, direct manner. His music is a celebration of life, not subtle.
Well, Dmitri Tiomkin had never worked with William Wellman before, but I think in the aftermath of Tiomkin's Oscar success with High Noon in 1952, Tiomkin was certainly a familiar name in Hollywood and someone that I think Wellman wanted to work with. So in October of 1953, Wellman contacted him and invited him to the set. And so Tiomkin came over and actually met John Wayne and talked with Wellman and met the author, Ernest Gann, all on the set in November of '53. And he was signed to do the picture. He spent the most time, I think, working on the main theme for the film. It was something that he came up with in November that harks back to a piece of music he'd actually written in the early 1930s, but had never used before. He shared it with his wife and with a couple of colleagues, and they were all enthusiastic about it. And it was, of course, as we know, a great tune that later on became a big hit.
And interestingly, when you watch the movie, you will see that this theme is carried on throughout the movie, not only in other underscore cues, but as well it's the theme that John Wayne whistles throughout the movie. And his nickname, as you know, is Whistling Dan.
We used to call him Whistling Dan. One of the finest men you'd ever know.
The character of Dan Roman is introduced at the beginning of the picture as someone who whistles and was known for whistling around the plains.
I heard you whistling, and I said to myself, only one guy does that just so.
It was clearly in the script that Dan Roman was going to be whistling. So while Wellman was shooting, what John Wayne was actually whistling was a George M. Cohan tune called Mary. And I have to believe that Wellman and Tiomkin talked about replacing that at a certain point. For one thing, you'd have to license the George M. Cohan tune, and they would own the Tiomkin piece. And I also like the idea that the tune that Dan Roman is whistling is also the theme for the film. So come recording session time, Tiomkin brought in Hollywood's best-known whistler, Muzzy Marcelino, who had this great vibrato to actually whistle for John Wayne, and of course all that was then overdubbed. What is interesting about it is that when the song became a hit, a couple of the hit records actually had whistling on them. And when it came time to campaign for the Academy Awards, you would see trade ads that would say, "The tune that got America whistling again."
Tiomkin was a master at thematic writing. And this picture is a complex of a number of different themes. It's not a single theme, it's multiple themes.
For example, the theme for the plane in flight, which we hear just after takeoff in the movie. This recurs quite a lot when we're seeing exterior shots of the plane in the air. One of the interesting things about Tiomkin's approach is the fact that he did write small motifs, that is, sort of miniature themes for many of the characters. You only hear them once or twice. The one you hear most prominently is the one for Toby, the little boy, which is often played on solo violin. There's a major theme called Jubilo, which does not appear until the very end of the picture as the passengers are disembarking. Jubilo being Italian for rejoicing or jubilant. It's a celebratory piece which has a kind of classical bent, and that we only hear at the end of the film, but it's quite prominent.
The other thing that's interesting in the scores is the use of the female choir, and when he chose to bring it in for the first time, I think that was a great decision on his part. We don't hear it until the sailor that's on the boat goes out onto the deck and crosses himself. And that's the first time we hear the female choir. You know, one of these subtle things that no one really notices when they're watching the film, but works so well in a subconscious way.
Tiomkin said that what he was looking for in the theme, and that what he came up with, was something that had a kind of spiritual or religious quality to it. They recorded in March and April of 1954. There were 8 sessions, and the orchestra was as big as 83 players at some point, which really was quite large for Hollywood. An indication, I think, that they were putting not only a lot of money, but a lot of effort into the score of the film.
When you listen to the score, you realize it's much more complex than many of those going on at the same time by other composers. And I think that's part of its enduring legacy, is that it is so well constructed, and it's so fun to listen to.
The way he used the instruments of the orchestra was not so much unusual as it was taking advantage of all the sounds that they were capable of producing. In sections where the trombones and tuba were present, he would have them in even a more brassy way coming out on a scale going down, while the rest of the orchestra was soaring above it, so that you'd suddenly have 2 voices creating double excitement going on at the same time. He would use solo instruments quite often. And in one section in The High and the Mighty, he literally has the woodwinds playing a bar of oboe, a bar of clarinet, a bar of flute. They're all playing the same melody line, but it's flowing so that the sound of the instrument changes as the melody flows along.
After High Noon and after the surprise success of that becoming a mega hit song, you know, everybody was asked to, including Tiomkin numerous times afterwards, I think in many instances probably with less success, to come up with a tune that can be converted into a song.
And it's especially true in the aftermath of High Noon, because that song in the film, and the fact that it was released before the movie came out, became a hit. Then studio executives started demanding songs in their movies because they realized that a song on the radio was easy, free, and widely available promotion for them. It really changed the way a lot of movies were marketed in the 1950s.
And it would be stuffed into the picture whether it was dramatically appropriate or not.
The film was already over 2 hours and 20 minutes long, and the filmmakers were looking for places to trim and cut. The interesting thing about the song not appearing in the movie is that, according to Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences rules, the song has to appear somewhere in the movie. You actually have to hear the song being sung in order for it to be eligible for the Best Original Song category. The score obviously was already eligible for Best Original Score. There was quite a hue and cry about that because it was a big hit on the radio and it had been written for the movie. But the Academy would not budge. So in December of 1954, the song was ruled ineligible for the Best Song category. The studio then took matters into their own hands and cut the song back into the picture and played it for 1 week in the Los Angeles area, which made it therefore eligible for the Academy Awards. Tiomkin lost in the Best Song category to Three Coins in the Fountain, but he won the Best Original Score award for The High and the Mighty. This is his second time at the Oscars, having won for High Noon. And so he got up there and in his acceptance speech thanked Beethoven, Brahms, Wagner. The audience howled with laughter. The assumption being that Tiomkin was more or less tacitly acknowledging the fact that a lot of film music has its origins in the classics.
He came off the stage dumbfounded, a little confused. Why are they laughing?
Tiomkin later said that he was just trying to pay homage to his musical heroes from the past, who had made it possible for him to earn this kind of great living in Hollywood. Tiomkin was nominated almost 24 times for songs and scores. He won 4, 2 for High Noon, 1 for The High and the Mighty, as we know, and 1 for The Old Man and the Sea in 1958. He was unique, however, in that he was nominated as often for his songs as he was for his scores.
Dmitri's Russian heritage really serves him well as a film composer because, as Elmer Bernstein would have said, Tiomkin knew how to write a good tune.
He was the only Russian-born composer to really make it big here.
It's interesting when you think a Russian wrote some of the most remembered Western songs and themes.
He did Rawhide, which everyone knows, and it's fantastic.
He saw the Western frontier and the Russian steppes as being extremely similar, and the kind of person that lived out on the plains in Russia not too dissimilar from the American cowboy.
I was born in Russia. When I was about 9 years old, my mother, who was a famous pianist, gave me the first instructions. Later, I studied piano with Felix Blumenfeld and composition with Alexander Glazunov.
His father had left his mother, and he'd moved to Berlin, so his mother was left with Dmitri and his 2 sisters. His mother used to give piano lessons to support the children. She had graduated from the Warsaw Conservatory of Music. His mother taught him to play as a child, and then he was sent to the conservatory. Glazunov was head of the conservatory. He went to Berlin, where his father was living, and I think Glazunov arranged for him to study under Busoni there.
The story has it that he discovered American music somewhat by accident.
He used to go to a cafe called the Homeless Dog restaurant, where all the artists met.
A package arrived that was wrapped in sheet music for Alexander's ragtime band from America. And so he pulled this out and played it and became fascinated with it.
But in 1924, I went to Paris, and there I got in contact with what you call modern music.
He met Gershwin, they became good friends, and was responsible for premiering the Concerto in F.
I always was interested in America, and America at that time got more and more interested to the use of so-called jazz in concert music, and began experimenting with music in film. I too was called out there to MGM.
Working on the Frank Capra movies, as he did as early as 1937 and through the 40s, it was Capra who introduced him to American folk tunes. traditional American sounds and melodies, old cowboy songs. All of that came in handy when Tiomkin began his Western phase in the late 40s and into the 50s. But it's also true that Capra's hiring of Tiomkin to do the music for his World War II documentary series, Why We Fight, also was a great introduction to Tiomkin of all of these traditional military-oriented pieces. And I think probably the Coast Guard theme that we hear in The High and the Mighty is the product of being familiar with that material.
I've had the great opportunity to see his original scores. It's always kind of like peeking in someone's window to look at a composer's original scores, because you realize that their hand was on that paper, their eyes were looking at that paper, and their hearts and their minds were working at that moment to take that blank page, look at a visual, and then say, okay, this is what music needs to do to support it. It was absolutely fascinating.
Tiomkin nearly always conducted his own scores. In the very early days on Lost Horizon, he had Max Steiner, but very early on, he knew that he wanted to not only conduct, but be in more control of the specific sounds he was getting from the orchestra.
Usually, if the piece of music is small in scale, the composer will write everything out. He'll say flute here, oboe there. If it's big, the composer simply doesn't have time to do that, and so he needs to trust someone else to fill out the full orchestra. Usually it's a long-standing relationship between a composer and an orchestrator. The composer trains the orchestrator as to what he likes and what he doesn't like, so that after a few films, there's a kind of rapport where not everything needs to be spoken again. And that works out really well. Different people orchestrated his work in different ways. George Parrish was an orchestrator he used for decades. And George had said, you need a small team of people on one of Dmitri's projects because one person would be dead. There's just too much to do for one person in the amount of time that's given. Elmer Bernstein once said that the orchestrator's job is to make the composer look as good as possible, as fast as possible. And with the time constraints of films, it's just not always doable with one person.
One of the things that was unique about Tiomkin was his awareness of the value of promotion and publicity. He was the first composer in Hollywood history to hire his own publicist. He was the first composer to actually campaign for Academy Awards because he knew what the value of that was. Tiomkin was much more present in terms of visibility than nearly any other film composer, certainly in the 1950s and into the 1960s. He was the only major composer in Hollywood who never signed a long-term contract with any studio. I mean, Max Steiner was at Warner Brothers, Alfred Newman was at 20th Century Fox, Miklos Rocha was at MGM for several years, but that was not the case with Tiomkin. He valued his independence. It was a kind of smart move business-wise. In fact, his independence led to his becoming a really first-rate negotiator, someone who broke new ground for composers in Hollywood in terms of getting the rights to their own music, which was rarely the case with Hollywood composers. And also, by the time 1960 rolled around, his $50,000 fee for the Guns of Navarone was the highest any composer had ever been paid for a single score.
I would have loved to have met Tiomkin. So much to learn from him, not only about scoring music, but the business of surviving in Hollywood. An interesting life, fascinating life.
He had an enormous range of interests. Just about anything would interest him, which made him a very interesting person to be with.
He was a pilot, a novelist, a screenwriter whose experiences were the stuff of legend. Ernest K. Gann was an adventurer who believed the saying, "A writer should write about what he knows best." Well, Gann knew flying, and John Wayne knew Gann's talent could be translated to the screen. It was a pairing that would make cinematic history. Learn more now through this profile on Ernest K. Gann's life.
Ernest Gann believed in the exactness of machines and the arbitrariness of fate. He was an adventurer who pressed his luck to the limit. Born in Lincoln, Nebraska in 1910, his career as an aviator spanned his roughneck adolescence of barnstorming, the lean and mean years of World War II in the Army Air Corps Air Transport Command, and progressed to the sleek commercial airliners such as the DC-4 and the Stratocruiser. Not content with life in the air alone, he tried his fortune on the sea in boats and ships of every description and set himself against the waves and wind of both the North and South Pacific. On the ground, he lived the life of a rancher, taking the weather as he found it, good or bad. Weather was a constant companion and a constant challenge on land, sea, and in the air. Ernest Gann lived every minute of his life as an adventurer, author, and artist. He made every minute count and recounted his life in books, films, and paintings.
During the time that Ernie was writing for the movies, starting in early 1950s, he would be ranked right along with the authors of today, such as John Grisham and Michael Crichton. You know, people say, golly, John Grisham, he's had 4 or 5 books of his made into movies. Michael Crichton's had at least the same. And they're probably the hottest authors going. But wait a minute. Do you realize that Ernie, right up into the 1980s, had 9 of his novels made into movies? And that's a big record, and it's going to be hard for anybody of that stature of author to ever equal. I mean, 9 of his novels made into movies is almost unheard of.
Ernie got all of his ideas from his own experiences. And he always wrote about the people he knew and the people or the events he was involved in. If there was a rescue mission he had to go on, you know, as a pilot, he wrote about that. So he really got to know the subject, what he was writing about. And the same thing with boats, or same thing with other type of adventures. And that's what the difference between his stories and some of the writers today. Ernie always had a very deep knowledge of the people he was writing about. And whether it's boats or planes or dramatic events, he always researched it very thoroughly, he experienced it, and he wrote about it. That's basically what his whole approach was to writing. When we talk about what makes a good story, you know, he always had these different points. He said, if you want to make a good story, you got to have it in an exotic location. You got to have interesting characters. You got to have a protagonist, you know, somebody, you know, you identify with. Make sure you have a beginning and an end. You're going to have the toughest time with the first shot. What's going to be your first shot in your story? And you're going to have the toughest time, what's going to be your ending? And if you figure those 2 things out, the middle is nothing. Because then you already know who your characters are, and you know what the ending is going to be. He loved when the story held together, when the people were interesting, and those are the stories he could write. When he did Sweet 16, well, he was 16 years old in 1926. I mean, if you go back, what films were made in 1926 by a 16-year-old kid? Having to borrow his mother's car and the kind of technique he used when they were driving, the kids were rocking the car to make it look like it's moving. And then the long shots are the only ones which actually the mother or the father drove. But everything else he did. He had this love affair with this beautiful girl with the, you know, dark hair, and he says, I knew I had to cast her into it, and I had to write a story about her. You know. the one who goes to the city, and when she comes back, she acts like a sophisticated lady, you know, and no longer wants to talk to him because he's a country bumpkin. He just stayed home, you know. See, that's how he gets his ideas. It's all from real life. And it became a financially successful picture. He spent $200 on it, and the first month he grossed $400 on it. So he paid everybody back, and it's an incredible film when you look at it. His father wanted him to be a phone company executive, you know, just like he was, and he tried to get him in there, and he was almost like forcing him to do something respectable, and instead of being an actor, or instead of, which he was, you know, like he went to New York and he became an assistant director, and then he tried the stage, and he went to Yale also. He spent 2 years at the Yale Drama School. He was telling me the stories about, you know, how he felt when he first got introduced to literary things, although he was in the military academy, but he didn't care that much about it. But he had a very good drama teacher over there at the academy who inspired him and told him that you are a good, you know, you can be a good writer. If you have the discipline and you want to do it, you're going to be okay. And he did, and that's how he got started with the writing, way back, you know, when he was very young. He took a flying lesson when he was like 16 or 17 years old. When he was a commercial pilot, you always spend a lot of times in hotel rooms waiting to return with a flight and so on. Ernie decided to write during that period of time.
I knew him for 38 years, from 1953 till the day he died in 1991. Somebody that I'll never, ever forget. He and I roomed together when we made Island in the Sky, directed by William A. Wellman. I was the first assistant director. Ernie was a script writer, and they put us together. We roomed together in Truckee, California, in the deep snow and the shivering cold with John Wayne and a really good cast. Just like myself, in 1953, John Wayne became acquainted with Ernie Gann for the first time. And I could tell right away that they were very compatible and became very, very fast friends. So much so that Ernie gave him first chance at the High and the Mighty. He showed him the galley proofs, and Wayne's company at that time was Wayne Fellows, making pictures for Warner Brothers, and they snapped it up.
I'm going to take her down.
Wait a few more minutes, Captain.
Do as I say.
But it looks like...
Do as I say.
Give him a few more minutes.
I've already waited too long. Here we go.
He doesn't have any weak characters. He doesn't have, you know, the yes-men type of people as his heroes, you know. He always have some pretty strong characters.
We have nothing to talk over. Anyone who would sell a New York advertising agency for a broken-down mine in Canada just to make yourself feel important.
One of his shortcomings, he admitted to me, he says, I have a difficult time to write a film in which a woman would be the main character. I guess the female sex was something mystical for him.
Come and see me when you grow up, Junior.
I think he liked The High and the Mighty very much. I think that was one of, and Island in the Sky. Those kind of stories became old-fashioned. If you look at today's movies, so few of them are the big movies, the big Hollywood movies. And on those days, his films were the big Hollywood movies. He was very often on the set. He was consulted about things during the shoot, which is, you know, I know how directors are. They often don't like to have the writer on the set because, you know, if they make a change, you know, the writer can be pretty upset about any kind of a change, and you have to make changes sometimes. But Ernie was respected so much that they hired him as I almost thought he was a consultant, you know, to the directors who he was working with. He writes a screenplay because he wrote many of the screenplays, not just original stories. He knew about what the camera is going to do, or how the camera will be handling that, or how you're going to translate that script into a film. You know, his legacy is that his stories were very visual, very inspiring and dramatic, and he was writing about basically bigger-than-life characters. And I think that's important to see that, because they create a role model for other people, you know, unlike what some of the movies are doing today. He spent about 30 years of his life on San Juan Island, and he took a job at San Juan Air, which was a little commuter airline.
I asked him why he wanted to fly for us, and I knew I understood that he didn't need it financially, but he said, well, he had done all these various things and types of flying, but he had never flown commercially with little airplanes, and he wanted the experience of doing it.
He's like the gentleman farmer, but he got his hands dirty. For example, he was part of the cattle drive. You know, in those days, they allowed the cattle to be driven from one field to another field. He was always part of it. He wasn't just the guy who just looks at the cattle from his window. He's out there and helping with the branding and so on. But he wanted to be part of that, and he didn't want to just look at other people doing it. Because he loves the boats, and I had my own boats up there. We always went out fishing, and during the times when the fish wasn't biting, we had to talk about something. So we talked about politics, religion, but mainly about writing and what makes a good story. But he was the incredibly diligent person. I mean, he went to his chicken coop, you know, because the studio where he was writing was originally a chicken coop.
His writing routine was depending on what he was doing. Started first off in the morning, around 8 in the morning, lunch at 12:30, and then he could play, relax on small boats or the big boats, whatever he had in the afternoon. And then he would spend his evenings out there painting.
He never stopped writing. I mean, if you look at the YouTube book, you know, he was 78 or 79 years old. That was his last book which he wrote. And all the people in the military, you know, read his books. So when it came time to do the U-2 story, you know, he had to call a couple of generals and say, I'd like to do a story on the U-2, but I can't just write about the U-2 from what I know. I got to go there. So he went to Northern California, to Biala Air Base, and he spent weeks and weeks over there. Well, the U-2 was a spy plane, obviously, and he was the only private pilot who was allowed to fly in the U-2.
You're in this pressurized suit, a spacesuit, which is very uncomfortable. When it gets as high as it goes, it's fascinating because you're in this little cockpit. It's basically an F-104 cockpit. And when you look out, you go, my gosh, that's an awful long way down. And the Earth is round and the sky is black. And it's a fascinating experience.
He was just so happy when he came back, and he says, guess what? I flew finally, you know, the U-2. I went up to 70,000 feet, which is an incredible accomplishment of a person of that age. But again, this is an example of, he never slowed down. You know, it wasn't that I give up flying because I'm already too old. He said, I think I had said everything what I wanted to say in my books, and now it's time for me to do something else. And you know, he kind of turned back to his paintings, and he says, this is my satisfaction now.
What means you're using to express your creativity, to say what you want to say? You can do it with a pencil, you can do it with oils, you can do it with watercolors, you name it, or with stone, all of which are different techniques, but they're all saying the same thing. It says, I want to tell you a story, or it should. The written word is the same way. I want to tell you a story. And those that do not tell a story usually don't do very well.
The paintings were getting so popular that Boeing commissioned him to do almost like a calendar. They wanted him to do 12 different paintings. He didn't want to do 12 of them. I think he did about 3 of them, and it's still at the Boeing headquarters. And then he had a series of paintings on the Mutiny on the Bounty.
These 10 paintings are the result of a lifetime of fascination with the Bounty story on my part. Making these paintings was extremely difficult because portraits of Bligh are almost non-existent. And in the fashion of the time they were done, as vanity portraits. They really didn't look like the person, but complimented them greatly. I have tried to show in a portrait of Bligh the man just before the mutiny.
He had a painting exhibit at one of the galleries here in Bellevue, and lots of people ended up buying, you know, his paintings, and he got pleasure out of it. As you grow older, you may not be able to do all the things what you were able to do before, but he always found the challenge to do something which fit in within the framework of where he was in his life. On his 77th birthday, he decided, he was talking to his fellow pilot, and they were reminiscing that we've done all these things, you know, flying together and so on, but we never jumped out of an airplane. So his friend, Roy Franklin, who also lives on the island, he says, why would anybody jump out of an airplane unless it's going down? So Ernie says, well, I sure like to do it once before I die. And he was already 77 years old. And his friend was also approximately 78, 79. So they made a decision that if you jump out, I'll jump out. So that's what they did. So they went up there with Roy Franklin's son, who's also a pilot, went up there above their property, and they own like 700 acres of beautiful land over there, and they jumped out and they landed in their own backyard, basically. So that's the kind of guy he was. He just kept going and going, and at age 77, not too many of us would want to be, you know, jumping out of the airplane.
You just cannot quit. You are, every day, you want to create something. The mere fact that this man's eyes are looking the way that they look, and he is looking the way he looks, that's a creative act. I have done that. I've played God here momentarily. And if it's right, it's tremendously satisfying. If it's wrong, you don't sleep nights. Not too long ago, I was told by some of our medical profession, quite a few, as a matter of fact, that my time on this planet was extremely limited. Well, I've been lucky. I've proven them wrong. And I intend to keep doing it. And I think part of the reason is this creative drive. Whether it's good or bad is not the point. It's there. It's like a charging engine. And it kind of falters as the day goes on until bedtime. And then I'm all kind of through. But it charges out in the morning and ready to go with more of it. Well, you never have a headwind. So that kind of says more about creativity than I really should say. I think God bless the man who knows he has said enough and cannot be persuaded to say more.
Making a film is one thing. Preserving and restoring that film present an entirely different set of challenges. In the case of The High and the Mighty, it's a modern-day drama.
Conservation and restoration are the cornerstones of preserving our cultural heritage, whether in art, antiquities, classic cars, or film. At Cinetech, the world's premier film restoration lab, an army of workers is dedicated to the exacting process of rescuing films. Their state-of-the-art conservation techniques are saving the cherished classics, so movie fans and film scholars will be able to see The High and the Mighty the way it was intended.
For both film lovers and filmmakers, it's essential to know and understand and appreciate what's come before.
Well, imagine the world of literature denied the works of Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway. And that's what's happening to the movies. It's always important to do the commercially successful pictures And it's essential to show films in their best possible state. So when a film is put out on this miraculous new invention of DVDs, then it should look as good as it conceivably can.
The films that we're preserving now are done with the best technology and the best film stocks, and they're going to be around for generations to come. And I think it's going to be fabulous to get it back out there.
It was a long-time dream of John Wayne's son, Michael, to see The High and the Mighty restored to its original glory. Achieving that goal was a labor-intensive 12-month process, and that was just for the picture.
One of the biggest problems we had with the original negative was it had suffered a lot of damage over the years. It had a lot of wear. It was also the color fading. All of the optical dissolves and some of the inner negative main and end titles were also very, very faded.
There were also three of the reels of the 18 that didn't exist in the original negative anymore.
There was an area of the original negative that apparently had been edited out of the second half of reel 7. It was 12 feet that was actually taken out, and we managed to find that in the separation masters. We had the separation masters that were made in 1953, as well as the original negative, and we also had a full recombined inner negative that was used as a primary source for most of the replacements.
To erase 50 years of wear and tear to the soundtrack, Gretchen Wayne, the president of Batjack Productions, turned to the experts at Chase Audio, who employed a variety of techniques over 3 months of restoration work.
First step at the beginning is to recover as much of the original audio as possible from the supplied elements from the client.
Our restoration engineers and our transfer engineers get together and we decide on what the best elements are. There were many small anomalies in this track that I could address here at this stage. Different splice bumps. I removed hum, hiss, pops, dropouts. Some of those things I had to smooth out and make an ambience that was more consistent.
There was a lot of wear and tear on the audio tracks, and we used a process called a vitalizer, which is a harmonic content creator. It helps restore the natural high-frequency harmonics of program material. All the work that we put into the audio should be invisible, ideally. I would hope that people thought that this was just the way it always sounded, and that there was no inkling that anything had been done. That's, I think, the best result.
Now this classic film has been returned to its full glory, and a new negative is ready for climate-controlled storage. But the importance of film restoration and preservation can't be overstated.
At the most basic level, motion pictures are our history. And, you know, films can tell us more vividly about the way people lived and how they thought than any history book.
And a great many films have been saved from the brink of extinction in the past 20 to 30 years, and that's very rewarding.
No two people see a film the same way. Join me as we examine one of my favorite John Wayne films from a critic's perspective.
After 50 years in the vaults, The High and the Mighty is finally fully restored and ready to be seen by film fans around the world.
I think it's fascinating that a film that's been out of circulation as long as this one has been is still so well remembered, that it's still a film people are eager to see, hungry to see. And it's not just because it is out of reach, you know, the unattainable. It's because they remember it.
I heard you whistling, and I said to myself, only one guy does that just so. I'd know that ugly face of yours anywhere. But you don't remember me, I bet you.
Sure I do, Ben Sneed.
I love the exposition in The High and the Mighty. I love the very opening of the movie as everybody arrives and introduces themselves.
Ken Childs, 53, born Philadelphia.
It's the most obvious exposition you've ever seen in a movie. It draws you in, you have your cast of characters, you understand the conflicts that are going to start to erupt once they're all thrown into this situation on the plane, and you also get to see all these wonderful actors.
Thanks.
This is the kind of movie they used to call an all-star picture. In fact, if you look at the original ads, you'll see a series of headshots side by side. It's not just a John Wayne movie, it's John Wayne and all of these other well-known figures. There are cliches about John Wayne, that he always played the gung-ho hero. You look at the films, you see a broader range than that. And this is a perfect example because he's playing a man who has this terrible heartache in his life, a tragedy that he's trying on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis to live with and overcome. And that's really interesting.
Everything okay, Dan? Yeah, everything's fine. 3,050 aboard.
Robert Stack, who plays the square-jawed pilot here, played this kind of character an awful lot, and even got an Oscar nomination playing one a few years later in a film called Written on the Wind, directed by Douglas Sirk. I think there's something nice about seeing Claire Trevor there because that adds to this sense of continuity that I feel, and I think other fans feel, when they see so many John Wayne movies. You see people you feel comfortable with, and people that you're familiar with, often from other John Wayne movies. Claire Trevor was his co-star in Stagecoach when she was the bigger star. That was the film that made him an A-list star, but she was the more established person at that time. So this was a nice reunion, in a way.
I'm going to go back to San Francisco now. Thank you.
John Quaylen, who plays the fisherman taking his first flight, is somebody who worked in so many John Wayne and John Ford films. I can't begin to count them. He made, I think, literally a couple of hundred movies in his long career.
Sure, I forgot.
Paul Fix, who plays the man who's living on borrowed time, was an actor who dated back to the earliest days of talkies. He had stage experience before that. He later gained newfound fame on TV on The Rifleman. You've experienced actors in every part, large or small, from Sidney Blackmer, who's the passenger who's made his money selling some sort of a cure-all that may or may not be accurate, to George Chandler, who's the flight mechanic in the very first scene of the movie who says hello to John Wayne, who went back to the days of Max Sennett, to Regis Toomey, a director like William Wellman, who started out in the 20s, worked with every one of these people before, and he knew they were reliable. He knew they were good. He knew they could deliver.
Yes, sirree. The Waikiki Kids. Just put us down as a float the Rose Bowl parade.
Phil Harris, who plays the very bombastic fellow who's on a permanent honeymoon with his wife, Anne Duran, was a household name in the 50s. He had been on Jack Benny's radio show maybe more than 15 years at that time.
Somebody's wrong.
There's a small but noticeable part that's played by Carl Schweitzer, who is better known as Alfalfa. And it didn't look very different as a young man than he had as a kid, but that's a face you'll never forget. William Shallard, who plays the dispatcher, was at the beginning of a career that's still going strong, played Patty Duke's father on her TV series back in the 60s. A wonderful, wonderful actor of vast experience. Then, or now, a bestseller is a great pedigree for any movie. You have a pre-sold title people already know. If they enjoyed the storytelling, they're likely to enjoy the film version of it. Ernest K. Gann was associated with stories to do with aviation in some way or another, but he was a good storyteller too, and he knew how to, plot a film with interesting characters or a book. And in this case, he adapted his own novel. Like every movie, it's a mirror of its time. It's a little miniature time capsule, and that's not intended. They're just making a film for audiences to see, but then looking back from a standpoint of some 50 years, you see how different we were in terms of everything, fashions and attitudes, outlooks. The fact that in the 50s, a little boy would be playing cowboys and Indians and have his holster and his little gun. Hollywood was in the midst of great upheaval in the 1950s because television had asserted itself in the late 40s, and by the early 50s, there was no question it was here to stay. It was becoming a real fixture in American homes. Now, they had to lure people away from their living rooms where they were getting entertainment for free. So you'll see at the beginning of the film that the biggest letters on the screen, right at the top of the picture, are the ones that spell out the word CinemaScope. It was a selling tool. It was part of what people were going to see, not just John Wayne and all those other stars, but CinemaScope. Remember that because this was an early CinemaScope movie, Wellman couldn't use stock footage from any other movie of planes taking off, landing, flying, skimming through the clouds. He had to shoot them. And so this was all done specifically for this movie, and all the aerial shots are credited to William Clothier, who was a top cameraman, who was a combat cameraman during World War II and had aviation experience, and then later became one of John Wayne's favorite cameramen. The High and the Mighty got 6 Oscar nominations. It only won 1 Academy Award, and that was for Dmitri Tiomkin's score, a pretty powerful and famous score. Though his song with Ned Washington didn't win. It was nominated, it didn't win. But 2 of its actresses were nominated, Jan Sterling and Claire Trevor, and Academy wisdom says sometimes if there's 2 from the same movie, they cancel each other out. Maybe that was the case. And then for film editing, and then for Best Director, William Wellman.
We can only stay in the air another 30 seconds. Full flap! Full flap!
This film had a tremendous impact. It was a hit, but besides being a hit, it had a hit song, it had a mystique that has survived all these years. People liked it.
So long, you ancient pelican.
It's great to have the High and the Mighty back in circulation, to be appreciated and enjoyed. And you know what? Even after half a century, it still looks mighty good.